The quiet woman in row 3, Nina walked through the jet bridge, holding tightly onto her son. Caleb's hand, her other arm, clutching a slim leather tote as they stepped into the aircraft, the air conditioning hitting them with a cold that felt like a warning. Her eyes scanned the seats, and she found them quickly. Row 3 seats, A and B, window and middle seat, just like she had reserved 3 months in advance. She always planned ahead, always double-checked the details, not because she feared mistakes, but because experience had taught her the world did not always offer second chances. Especially not to women like her, who had skin the color of rich mahogany and hair coiled in tight spirals that told stories of strength and survival. She helped Caleb into his seat, then lowered herself into hers, exhaling slowly, as if the simple act of sitting down meant she had conquered something bigger than most people would ever see. Caleb looked excited. He pressed his face to the window, watching the baggage handlers below tossing suitcases like puzzle pieces, trying to fit into the belly of the beast. His small backpack was on his lap, unzipped slightly, revealing the comic book he had insisted on bringing. His fingers twitched ready to open it, but he looked at his mum instead, as if needing her permission to relax. She gave him a soft nod, and he smiled, opening the comic without another word. Nina sat still, her back straight, her eyes forward. She heard the shuffle of other passengers boarding behind her, but she stayed focused, her hands resting calmly on her thighs. She was used to traveling, and even more used to the way people glanced at her like she was in the wrong place, or must have been upgraded by mistakes. He didn't need to be told how they saw her. She had lived it for years. The quick checks, the too long stares, the soft muttering under breath that carried judgment. No matter how polished her outfit was, no matter how expensive her luggage looked, no matter how educated her speech or calm her demeanor, she was always something they tried to fit into a box, and when she didn't fit, they made new boxes just to keep her out. Today, though she had hoped it would be different, just a trip with her son, a chance to finally take that weekend vacation they had promised each other for 2 years now, the one they kept pushing back because of work, school emergencies, and life's interruptions. But the peace was broken when a blonde stewardess with a stiff bun and red lipstick walked down the aisle and stopped beside their row. Her voice was sharp, even behind the fake politeness she carried in her customer service tone. "Excuse me, ma'am, we're going to need you and your son to change seats." Nina turned to her slowly, unsure if she had heard correctly, and she asked for clarification. The stewardess smiled tighter. "We have to platinum elite passengers who need to be seated in row 3, and we've had some confusion with bookings, so I'll need you to relocate further back." Nina blinked calmly and said, "I reserved these seats weeks ago, and we are not moving." "I'm sorry." The stewardess's smile faltered, and she leaned in slightly as if her height gave her authority. "I understand, ma'am, but they are high-level travelers, and we are trying to accommodate everyone. If you refuse, we may have to escalate the matter." Nina didn't raise her voice, didn't gesture wildly. Instead, she glanced at her son, then back at the stewardess, and said firmly, "We are not moving. I paid for these seats. I selected them because my son gets nervous flying, and he needs the window. It is non-negotiable." The stewardess didn't respond immediately. Instead, she turned sharply and walked away, muttering something to the flight crew as she passed them. Nina noticed the change in energy immediately. Whispers exchanged behind galley curtains, glances thrown like daggers in her direction, and soon another attendant came, this one taller, older, his voice more clipped. He asked again with a stronger edge in his tone to please move, and again Nina refused. Caleb looked up from his comic, his eyes wide and uncertain. "Are we doing something wrong?" Mama Nina reached for his hand and squeezed it gently. "No, baby, we are doing what's right. Just sit tight." The situation escalated. When the head purser was called, he had a tablet in his hand and pretended to check some booking details, but Nina knew he was stalling, trying to pressure her into giving in. Other passengers were now watching, some curious, some annoyed, a few visibly uncomfortable. Nina felt their stares like heat on her skin, but she didn't flinch. The purser finally said, "Ma'am, if you don't comply, we may have to ask you to This is creating a delay, and we must keep the schedule moving." Nina tilted her head, and for the first time she spoke a name. "My name is Nina Jefferson, and I suggest you check your internal crew roster and compliance alert list before continuing." The purser hesitated, confused. He stepped away, pulling out his radio, and began whispering to someone while glancing back at her. His posture had changed slightly, his shoulders tighter, his hands shaking just a little. Caleb was now gripping her fingers, and she leaned down and whispered, "It's okay, Mama's here. We're safe." The pilot came out of the cockpit shortly after. He was a man in his early 50s, graying hair, neat uniform. His eyes scanned the row and landed on her. He crouched beside her seat with the awkwardness of someone trying to remain calm, while his insides churned, and he asked quietly, "Excuse me, ma'am, but are you the Nina Jefferson who works with the Civil Aviation Diversity Task Force?" Nina nodded without fanfare. The pilot's face went pale. He rose swiftly, turned, and walked back up the aisle. No words spoken, but the energy shifted like a storm cloud lifting in. Under 5 minutes, the entire cabin crew that had been part of the interaction was removed from the flight one by one. The 2 flight attendants, the head purser, and even the crew supervisor were escorted off. Passengers watched in stunned silence. Some pulled out their phones and began recording. Others murmured, trying to piece together what had just happened. A new crew was brought in from the terminal, emergency replacements. Rarely seen unless something went catastrophically wrong, but no one dared question it. Caleb looked at his mother, his voice small and filled with awe. "What did you do, Mama?" Nina looked out the window at the runway stretching into the distance and said, in a tone so calm it almost sounded like peace, "I reminded them that no one is above respect and no one is below dignity." But she knew this wasn't the end, because what had just happened would echo far beyond this aircraft, and the airline had no idea who Nina truly was, not just her title, not just her affiliation, but her mission, and now they had given her a reason to raise her voice louder than ever before. Her phone buzzed quietly in her lap, a message from her legal advisor asking if she needed the press involved. Nina didn't answer, not yet. First, she wanted to see if the company would do the right thing, but deep down she knew they wouldn't. Not without a reason, not without pressure, so she drafted the email, her fingers flying across the screen, detailing every moment from the first request to the forced confrontation, including the names of the employees, the reactions of witnesses, and her credentials that were so conveniently ignored. Caleb leaned his head on her arm, his comic book forgotten, his breathing even. Nina brushed his curls back and looked at the screen again, rereading her message before pressing send. It was a storm in waiting, and she was not afraid to let it hit behind her. Someone whispered, "I think she's someone important," and someone else added, "I think they just fired the wrong crew because of the wrong woman." But Nina knew it was never about importance. It was about justice, and now the story had begun for real, and by the time it ended, it would not be Nina who had to explain herself. It would be the airline, the executives, and everyone who watched and said nothing. She wasn't just a passenger. She was a mother, she was a leader, and now she was a symbol of what happened when quiet women in row 3 decide not to be quiet anymore. The silence before the headlines. The plane landed in New York just after sunset, the city lights glowing like 1,000 eyes watching from below. As Nina and Caleb stepped off the aircraft into the busy terminal, the mood was different. Flight attendants stood straighter, agents at the gate glanced at her and quickly looked away, as if uncertain whether to speak or remain invisible. Nina held her son's hand, calmly weaving through the crowd, but her mind was no longer on baggage, Clem, or finding their hotel. It was already racing ahead, calculating options, consequences, and how to transform this moment into something larger than personal justice. Behind her, people whispered again, not with the same tone as on the plane, but with curiosity and awe. Some had seen the crew escorted off, others had caught glimpses of Nina speaking softly with the pilot, and pieced things together. Someone important, someone untouchable, someone who made the company nervous, and that alone made her powerful in their eyes. But Nina had never cared for power. She cared for truth, and what her son had witnessed today was unacceptable. She called a car, and as it pulled up, Caleb jumped in first, smiling now as if the drama from earlier had evaporated into the warm night air. But Nina stayed outside the car for a moment, phone to her ear, as she spoke with her advisor. "Again, the story has teeth," she said. The advisor responded carefully. "They're already trying to contact you for a private meeting." Nina nodded slowly, then said, "Schedule it for tomorrow morning, and make sure they bring the director, not a PR The hotel room later that evening, while Caleb slept curled under the blanket with his stuffed toy beside him, Nina sat at the desk with her laptop open, the glow casting shadows on her face as she typed paragraph after paragraph, recounting the incident, attaching timestamps, screenshots, emails, and finally the draft of the complaint she would file with the Civil Rights Aviation Board. She read it twice before sending, then drafted a second version, not for legal eyes but for the public, a statement of experience and identity, something that would explain not only what happened but why it mattered. She stared out the window at the skyline, wondering how many others had experienced something similar, but never had the chance to speak out how many mothers had been forced to stand down, how many children had watched their parents be silenced. She would not let that be the story her son remembered. No, not this time. The following morning came quickly. Nina walked into the corporate office of the airline with the same grace she had carried onto the flight 2 days earlier, except now the staff greeted her differently, no longer with suspicion, but with cautious respect. The receptionist barely made eye contact and gestured nervously to the elevator, where an escort waited in silence. The ride to the top floor felt longer than it was, the air heavy with tension, as if the walls themselves knew something had shifted inside the boardroom. 3 executives waited there, smiles tight, and words chosen too carefully. The director, a balding man with tired eyes, stood as she entered, and extended his hand. Nina took it but said nothing. Instead, she sat across from them and opened her folder without invitation. "This is what happened," she began, her voice steady. "The attendants singled me out for removal without any cause other than convenience. The requested seats were paid for in advance, booked through the official portal, and confirmed by your own system. What followed was not only discriminatory in nature, but reckless in its escalation. Your crew chose to threaten a passenger in front of her child for the sake of appeasing someone with higher social status, and they did it without pausing to ask who they were." Humiliating. The room was silent except for the hum of the air conditioner. The executives scribbled notes, or at least pretended to, but none interrupted. She continued, "I was not looking for special treatment. I did not raise my voice or demand favors. I simply held my ground and exercised the rights I was guaranteed as a passenger. Your crew saw that as defiance and reacted with intimidation and bias. And when it became clear that I would not back down, the truth came out. The very people you tried to dismiss were the ones assigned to help fix the problems you created." The director shifted uncomfortably before speaking. "Ms. Jefferson, we want to express our sincerest apologies for the way you were treated, and we take this matter very seriously." Nina raised an eyebrow. "Do you take it seriously because of who I am, or because you got caught?" The director hesitated before replying honestly, "Both. And that is something we need to change." Nina nodded slowly. "I am not here for a check or a media stunt. I am here because I believe in the system. I work within, and I still believe that accountability is possible, but it has to be earned, and you are going to earn it." She laid out the list of actions she wanted: full transparency about the crew's removal, an internal investigation made public, a review of training protocols related to racial bias and passenger rights, and a formal apology, not just to her, but to every passenger who had experienced similar treatment without recourse or recognition. The director agreed more quickly than she expected, perhaps because he knew there was no other option, and Nina left the building with a sense of clarity, not victory, not relief, but clarity. This was the beginning, not the end, and the world would soon know what had happened on Flight 2817 and why it mattered back. At the hotel, Nina opened her email inbox and saw something new: dozens of messages from strangers, from mothers, students, activists, flight attendants, all sharing their own experiences. Some offered support, others told their own horror stories, but all of them said the same thing: "Thank you for not being silent. Thank you for not getting off the plane." Caleb looked up from the couch where he was watching cartoons and asked, "Are we going to be on TV now?" Nina smiled, not because of fame but because her son understood the magnitude of what had happened. "Maybe," she said, "but what matters is that they listened." He nodded slowly, then said, "I'm proud of you, Mama," and she held his hand tightly, remembering the fear in his eyes when the attendants had first approached them, remembering how small and uncertain he had looked, and how that fear had now turned into pride. She knew this story would spread, not because of drama or scandal, but because it spoke to something deeper, something millions of people carried silently for too long, and now it had a voice. It had a name, it had a face, and it would not be ignored. But deep inside, Nina also knew there were people watching who were not happy with what she had done. There were those who would try to discredit her, or shift blame, or twist the narrative, and she had to be ready for that too, because the real fight was just beginning, and the next chapter would not be written by press releases or corporate apologies. It would be written by action and resistance and truth, and Nina Jefferson was ready. When apologies are not enough, 3 days had passed since Nina Jefferson walked out of the airline's corporate office, and although the executives had promised action and change, what followed told a different story. The apology they released was shallow, written more like a damage control memo than a true act of remorse. It lacked her name, it lacked the reality of what happened, and it did not mention the crew or the discrimination. It simply stated that the airline regretted an incident involving a misunderstanding, and reaffirmed its commitment to inclusion and customer care. Nina read it twice, then closed the screen, her jaw tight, her heart thudding, not from anger alone but from deep disappointment. She had trusted for a brief moment that the right thing might be done, not because of fear but because of understanding, but instead they had chosen silence. Dressed in corporate polish, they wanted the noise to go away, not the problem itself. Caleb was sitting across from her at the kitchen table, drawing superheroes again, his small fingers gripping a marker tightly, the page filled with bold strokes and bright colors. He had drawn a woman wearing a cape, with curly hair and dark skin, standing tall in front of a crowd of people, all cheering below her. Nina smiled softly, then turned back to her phone and dialed a number she had saved long ago, but never thought she would use. A voice answered clearly and directly. "This is Clara Ellis. How can I help?" Nina introduced herself, and there was a pause, then a sharp inhale. "You're the woman from Flight 2817. Nina confirmed and explained she had tried the internal route. She had given the airline every chance to take responsibility, and now she was done waiting. Clara was a journalist, but not the kind that chased gossip. She was known for exposing systemic failures and giving voice to the unheard, and when Nina spoke, Clara listened without interrupting once. Then she said, "I want to tell your story fully, truthfully, and with everything." They left out that night. They met in a quiet cafe corner table, far from wandering ears. Clara had a recorder, a notebook, and eyes that didn't flinch when Nina spoke about the moments that had stung the most. Not just the request to move, but the look in the attendants' eyes like she didn't belong. Not just the silence from passengers, but the ache of her son asking if they were in trouble for staying in their seats. Not just the forced apology, but the heavy truth that she could be highly educated, accomplished, connected, and still invisible to those who chose not to see her. Clara asked carefully, "What do you want people to understand?" Nina answered without hesitation that silence is not neutrality and politeness is not peace. "What happened to me happens every day to people without a badge or platform, and it hurts just the same, sometimes more, because they have nowhere to put that pain. I want people to know that refusing to move from your seat is not rudeness, it is resistance." Within 48 hours the article went live, titled "Quiet Woman in Row 3 Speaks," and it spread like fire. Nina's name trended online across platforms, not just because she stood up, but because she had done so without shouting. She had not thrown tantrums or curses. She had used her calm as a weapon, her dignity as armor, and people responded to it. Thousands of shares, hundreds of comments, messages pouring in from strangers, telling her their stories, thanking her for hers, and calling for accountability from the airline that now faced more than just embarrassment. The airline issued a second statement, this time more detailed, mentioning Nina, directly acknowledging procedural failure and promising a review of crew behavior, training, and escalation policies. But for many, it was too late, because the truth had already been spoken by the woman they had tried to remove, and the public had already chosen a side. But while praise came, so did the shadows. Nina began receiving threats, veiled messages warning her to back down, to stop stirring trouble, anonymous emails criticizing her for embarrassing the company or playing the race card as if her experience was a performance, not a lived reality. She reported the worst of them to the proper authorities, but the weight remained heavy, not because she feared them, but because she feared what they revealed about the world she was fighting to fix. Still, she refused to be silent. She was invited to speak on television, in forums, in conferences, but she chose carefully where to go and what to say. She did not want fame, she wanted change, and she reminded every audience that this was never about a seat on a plane. This was about how some people are asked to give up space, even when they have paid for it, earned it, and sat quietly minding their business, simply because others believe they are entitled to more. Caleb stood beside her at one event, holding her hand as they stepped onto a stage. The applause loud, but his voice louder when he said into the mic, "My mum didn't move because she knew it wasn't right, and I'm proud of her, because now nobody else will feel like they have." The crowd stood and clapped again, but Nina's eyes filled, not with pride alone, but with a quiet sadness too, because her son had learned a lesson far too early, that doing the right thing can still come with pain, and that dignity sometimes costs more than anyone should have to pay. But behind the sadness was a fire growing stronger every day, and Nina knew she could not stop now. The story had become larger than her, and she would carry it as far as it needed to go. The shadows of headlines and hashtags, executives where nervous meetings were held, reports commissioned, and the airline scrambled to prepare for what they feared most. A federal inquiry and class action calls were coming from advocacy groups, from regulators, from legal firms wanting to know how deep the bias went and how often it had been buried and ignored. Remained calm throughout, not gloating, not angry, simply clear in her mission and steady in her voice, because she knew now that she had tapped into something powerful and once awakened it could not be silenced again. This was not just a viral moment, it was a movement, and Nina Jefferson, the quiet woman in row 3, was leading it forward, one seat, one truth, one unshakable refusal at a time. The passenger manifestina sat in her living room, surrounded by open files, news clippings, messages from strangers and records. Her phone kept buzzing, but she ignored it for now. She needed clarity, focused direction after the storm came. The stillness, and it was in this quiet that the real battle often began. It had been a week since her story had broken through the surface of public attention, and the airline had responded with the kind of panic that only came when reputations and profits were under fire. But even now, with their second apology circulating and their promises of reform, Nina felt something missing, something deeper that had not been acknowledged or corrected. She stared at the flight manifest from that day, Flight 2817. Row by row it listed every passenger seat assignment, time of check-in, special status, and notes. Most of the entries were unremarkable: ordinary travelers, business class upgrades, mileage members, but 2 names near the top stood out, not because they were elite status, but because of what followed after their names in the notes section under remarks. The letters VIPEXT were listed in bold, and beside it, the code preferred seating, authorized by MANAGR. Nina blinked slowly, leaning back in her chair. This was it, the missing piece. She had suspected that her removal request had not been an error or a coincidence, but a decision, one that had come from someone higher up than a flight attendant. Now, the document proved that someone had authorized the request, someone with authority, and that someone had made a call that nearly humiliated a woman and her child based on assumptions and priority codes, not on fairness or right. She picked up her phone and dialed Clara Ellis, the journalist who had first helped her share the truth. When Clara answered, Nina wasted no time. "I found something. That codes on the manifest are not routine. This was a pre-cleared seating override." Clara asked, "Are you sure?" And Nina replied, "I cross-checked it with 3 different flight staff. I know from past policy groups, and this code is only used when someone wants to move passengers around for someone they consider more important." There was a pause, then Clara said, "Send it over. I want to run this deep." Nina knew what would happen next. Clara would verify the document, pull records, run background checks, find out who had flagged that seating change, and whether it was routine or personal. And if it was personal, then everything changed. The story would no longer be about one moment on a plane. It would be about a culture that quietly placed some passengers above others, even when it meant pushing out a mother and her son who had followed every rule and paid every cent. That night, Clara published a follow-up, titled "The Code Behind the Curtain." In it, she laid out the facts in plain words: the seating override code, the chain of command that could have authorized it, and the names of the 2 passengers who were supposed to take Nina's place. Both were regular travelers on the airline. Both had ties to senior staff. One of them was the spouse of a regional manager, the other a former executive, and the seating change had been requested manually, not because of an overbooking, but because of a personal favor. Nina read the article with a strange mix of triumph and sorrow. She had known from the beginning that this was bigger than just her seat. Now everyone else could see it too. The response was immediate, louder than before. Bolder people began demanding resignations, policy reviews, and congressional oversight. Travelers from across the country and even abroad started sharing their own stories of being moved or ignored or dismissed, all because someone more important needed space. But unlike before, they now had a name to rally behind and a symbol for their voice. Nina Jefferson. Airline stock dropped slightly, not enough to panic, but enough to get noticed, and the board of directors called an emergency session. Executives scrambled to protect themselves, but emails had been leaked, showing internal discussions about minimizing the story, delaying policy changes, and framing the incident as a misunderstanding that would pass like all the others. But this one did not pass because Nina refused to let it die. She accepted an invitation to speak at a transportation oversight hearing, and when she entered the chamber, cameras flashed and reporters whispered, but she remained calm, just like she had on the plane. Not here to be famous, not here to be angry, but here to speak the truth again. When she testified, she did not raise her voice, she did not accuse, she told them about the day she and her son boarded a flight, the quiet way they sat, the sudden request to move, the fear in her boy's voice, the pressure, the silence, and finally the moment when she had to choose between staying seated and staying small, and how she chose dignity, not for herself alone, but for everyone who had ever been asked to shrink themselves to make others more comfortable. The room was silent when she finished, not because they were unmoved, but because the truth had settled over them like a weight they could not deny, and the committee promised action, immediate review of priority, seating policies, oversight on passenger treatment complaints, and a new standard of reporting that included transparency about overrides and race-based incidents. When she walked out, Caleb was waiting with a small sign in his hand. It said, "My mum stood up," without standing up, and the crowd around them clapped, not because it was a clever phrase, but because it was true. And in that moment, Nina knew something deep inside had shifted, not just in policy, not just in people, but in her own heart. But her journey was not over, not yet, because in the silence behind all the noise, someone else had been watching. Someone who had made that override request, and who now sat in an office far from public view, writing emails, erasing traces, and preparing to protect themselves at all costs. And that someone was about to learn what happened when the quiet woman in row 3 turned her calm into action, the name behind the override. The boardroom smelled of panic, but the windows were open, and the air conditioning ran high, as if cold air could mask the heat of unraveling control. The regional manager sat stiff in his leather chair, his hands clasped, and eyes staring at the large screen in front of him. The headline glared in bold red letters: "Executive Override Confirmed in Discrimination Case. Anonymous Insider Leaks Emails Suggesting Cover-Up." He clicked through the attached files, his jaw tightening with every scroll. The email thread was there, clear as morning, the code, VIPEXT. The manual seat swap request, his assistant forwarding it with a brief message confirming that his wife preferred not to sit near the rear cabin passengers, who were often loud and unpleasant there. There was no room for denial now, no explanation polished enough to spin this away. And worse still, the name at the center of the storm, Nina Jefferson, had become untouchable, not because she threatened lawsuits, but because she stood with something bigger than herself. People did not just support her, they believed her, trusted her, and when someone becomes a symbol, truth becomes armor and reputation becomes sword. He picked up the phone and dialed internal legal, but the voicemail kicked in his hands, trembled for the first time since the news broke. He understood that this might not end in a warning or a suspension. This could destroy him. Across the city Nina was in a cafe, her laptop, open messages flashing faster than she could read them, people offering their stories, their gratitude, their fear. One message stood out, not because of the name, but because of the words it read: "I need to confess, I work in upper management, and I was there when they decided not to include your name in the first apology. It was intentional. They thought you would quiet down once the crew was removed, but when you spoke up again, they shifted strategy. The goal became containment and narrative control, not justice. I saved the emails because I knew it would come to this, and now I want you to have them." Nina stared at the message for a long moment, her heart steady, her mind spinning. The truth had always been buried just beneath the surface, and now it was surfacing fast. She replied simply, "I'm listening." Within minutes, encrypted files appeared in her inbox, detailing meetings, internal memos, strategies laid bare. One even included her profile with annotations describing how to handle her in the media. Words like composed, calculated, and likely to escalate appeared, as if her calm nature was something to suppress instead of respect. Clara met her that evening in the quiet of a newsroom filled with flickering monitors and tired reporters. Nina handed her the files, and Clara read silently, her fingers pausing every few lines, her eyes widening, then narrowing. "They knew," Clara whispered. "They planned it all and made it look like protocol." Nina said softly, "This goes beyond me. It goes to every person ever pushed aside in silence and told it was just a mistake when it was really a choice." The next article did not wait. Clara moved fast, this time backed by records, sources, and undeniable evidence. She published the full story, naming the executive behind the override, linking the requests to personal connections, and exposing the deliberate strategy to minimize accountability. The response came like Thunder. The airline issued a third and final statement this time. Not signed by the director but by the CEO himself. He acknowledged systemic failure, outlined resignations, including that of the regional manager, and announced the implementation of a new civil rights compliance board composed of external legal experts, former passengers, and advocates. Nina was offered a formal seat on the board. She did not answer right away. She needed time to think, not because she feared the responsibility, but because she wanted to be sure this offer was not another shield thrown up to protect the company from future storms. While she thought, the former regional manager issued his own statement, a public apology that read more like a plea for forgiveness than an act of integrity. I made assumptions. I acted out of comfort and preference, not fairness, and I recognize now the damage I caused. People debated his sincerity. Some demanded more, some mocked the late awakening, but Nina stayed quiet. 1 week later, she agreed to join the new board, not as a gesture of reconciliation, but as a guardian of change. She would not let this happen again. Not quietly, not invisibly, not ever. She returned to the same airport where it had all started, this time not as a passenger, but as a speaker for the new training initiative being rolled out to staff across the nation. She stood before a room of flight attendants, gate agents, and supervisors, sharing her story, not to shame them but to show them this is not about blame. She said, this is about vision, the vision to see every passenger not as a problem or inconvenience, but as a human being. The staff listened differently this time because they knew who she was, not just the woman in row 3, not just the face in the article, but the voice of a truth they could no longer deny. As she stepped off the small stage, Caleb ran up to her, grinning wide with pride. "You did it, Mama," he said. She knelt down, hugged him, and whispered, "No, baby, we did it because I refused to let you believe that quiet meant powerless." And just like that, a new chapter began, but still far away. In a quiet office, another name appeared in a file. One that had quietly influenced the seating policy across multiple flights. One that had escaped scrutiny during the public fallout, but had made similar override requests before, and that name was about to be discovered. Quiet strength becomes a storm. The months that followed the scandal became a whirlwind of change for Nina Jefferson, and for the airline, but mostly for the passengers, who finally saw that their voices mattered, that dignity was not a privilege for some, but a right for all. Nina's role on the Civil Rights Compliance Board grew from symbolic to powerful as she helped design policies that put accountability in black and white, and created channels where complaints were no longer ignored, but investigated swiftly and fairly. Cher traveled to airports across the country, speaking to crews, sharing stories, listening to fears and hopes, reminding everyone that every passenger was someone's mother, father, child, that behind each seat was a life deserving respect and care. Caleb came along often, sitting quietly in the back, drawing heroes with curly hair and capes, like the one his mother wore, not because she fought with fists, but because she fought with courage and calm. The airline restructured its training programs, introducing unconscious bias workshops, role-playing scenarios, and strict guidelines that no longer allowed personal favors to override fairness or respect. And when a new flight attendant asked Nina how she stayed so strong through it all, she smiled and said, "Strength is not loud, it is quiet, it is steady, it is the kind of power that moves mountains one seat at a time." But Nina knew the fight was never truly over. There would always be those who tried to rewrite stories to keep the comfortable comfortable and the invisible invisible. But she also knew that every story told, every voice raised, and every seat firmly held was a step closer to justice, and that was worth every challenge, every sleepless night, every whispered threat. One calm evening, as she sat on her porch watching the sun fade behind the trees, Caleb came outside holding a new drawing. This one showed a plane soaring high with passengers of every color, smiling, waving, and Nina's name written boldly beneath. Heath handed it to her and said, "Mama, this is what you changed." And Nina hugged him tight, feeling the full circle of their journey, from fear to pride, from silence to storm. She whispered to herself and to the world, "I will never give up my seat, my space, my voice, because quiet strength can become the fiercest storm, and no one can sit it down or take it away." And in that moment, the world seemed just a little bit fairer, a little bit kinder, and a little more ready to listen. The end.